Okay, so this is our third lecture video on Chapter 3, Human Growth and Development, and we're talking about the earliest stages of life, genetic development. And the last one, this was actually the last slide we were talking about. We're talking about the X and the Y chromosome, how there's more space on the X than there is on the Y, which goes to explain why a lot of conditions, there are a lot of conditions that seem to be more common in men, more common in boys, but they're carried by their females. So they are what is referred to as a sex-linked trait because they are linked to a specific chromosome. This was another slide with just terms on it. I just want to skip over it for right now. It's got a bunch of textbook terms on. I don't know that recessive and dominant would probably be the only two terms on there that would show up in some sort of evaluation, and I'll kind of talk about them right here. But here is another example, sort of an illustration of what we mean by sex-linked traits. So in this case, this is an example of colorblindness, right? And you'll notice that the female has the two X's and the X's are much larger. The male has an X and a Y. His Y is much smaller. In this case, so an allele refers to part of the chromosome. That is on the previous slide. But in this case, colorblindness is carried only on, it is, let me make sure I got this right, I believe it is considered a dominant trait. No, it says defective, I'm sorry. So in this case, you have a colorblind allele on this particular X chromosome. So one of her X's is fine, one of her X's is defective, and in colorblindness, if you have you have to have two, it's considered recessive, which means you have to have two of them for it to be present. If you have one right one and one wrong one, it will be right. And that's the difference between like recessive and dominant, but I'll talk about that, I think, at another point as well. So in this case, he has a normal X, so he's not colorblind. These guys have babies, right? And in one case, she gets mama's normal X and dad's normal Y, and she has normal vision. In one case, so this is recessive. In one case, she gets mom's normal X. She gets dad's normal X and mom's abnormal or colorblind X. And she is not colorblind because the trait on the normal one is, I don't want to confuse you by using dominant and recessive, but basically the abnormal one is weak. And so the stronger, correct one wins. In this case, he inherits mom's normal X and dad's shorter Y. So he has normal vision. In this case, he has dad's Y because he has to have a Y in order to be male, but he gets mom's abnormal colorblind. So because he doesn't have a backup, a normal non-colorblind backup gene, he's going to be colorblind. And so these are said to be sex-linked because colorblindness is clearly not on the Y gene, on the Y chromosome. There's not enough room. So having color vision or not having color vision is on the X. And mom can pass on a defective one or a healthy one. And that's what we mean by a sex-linked trait, that it's on the X chromosome. So mom passes it on. Her defective, if you will, genes get passed on to her children, but they only show up in her male children. Some other, I don't like to use the word abnormalities, but some other traits that could be not necessarily not common or potentially abnormal. Let me set my clock here, guys, so sorry about that. Have to do with when the X and the Y, when there's some sort of error in X and Y. So this is some sex chromosomes. Remember that what determines your sex, your genetic sex, if you are male or female, if you have a penis or a vagina, it's the X and the Y. In normal cases, you get an X and an X or an X and a Y. But there are some instances where something isn't right? We would call them abnormalities. in my social class, well, actually in my psych class too, sometimes we talk about like how many sexes do you think there are? Well, most people assume that there are two because there's XY and XX. But even at the genetic level, there are a handful of other possibilities. One is this one right here called an XYY. So you get an X from mom, and then you get two Y's from your dad. Um, Another one is where you would get two X's from your mom and also an X from your dad. And this is what's referred to as triple X. I think is it Turner syndrome? No, that's another one that you could inherit. And I got some images that sort of explain some of them. Another one is that you might get an X. I believe you get the X from your mom, but instead of getting a Y from your dad, you would get like an O. And this is considered Turner syndrome. So most of these, well, actually all of these, are conditions that they're not fertile, so they don't reproduce, right? Obviously, because something's not quite right with their sex chromosomes. And they come with additional cognitive impairments. There might be some cognitive delay, there might be some growth issues. So I believe it's Turner syndrome, and girls, they usually look female, are often quite short and have some other developmental issues that are not just related to their fertility. And another one that there's recently been some research on is called Fragile X. And so they get the X from, I think that one is also one you get from your mother. You get the Fragile X from your mother. Yes, that would be right, because so I don't like to use real life pictures of people, even though they're more interesting, because I always have to remind myself that these are people's children. These are people's children. But this is a sketch of typical facial structure of a Fragile X. So he gets the X from, no, sorry, he gets the Y from his father, which is the shorter one, but the fragile, I don't know why they call it fragile, but the X that he inherits from his mother has some genetic abnormalities associated with it. So some of the common characteristics are a big forehead, the eyes, I believe, are wider apart. It comes with some cognitive impairments that come with it. So some other sort of facial structures. These little girls over here, this girl, this child here is a fragile, no, I'm not sorry, she's a Turner syndrome. So she has the X and the O, and this one, it does not. And you can notice some of the distinctions here. She's got some more, the structure of her neck is different. She has a wider chest. I think some of the other characteristics that I've read about. And she also suffers from some, what you see here, some additional skin. So there's some physical characteristics that are associated with this one. Yeah, so down here on the bottom then is you see the X chromosome that the mom has, the fragile one that the mother has, and how she passes it on to her son, and he becomes symptomatic, and he shows the, I believe that's what we call it. In that other slide, you've got phenotype versus genotype. Phenotype refers to what you can see. Pheno, think photo. And then in this case, this XX offspring doesn't, they have the fragile X, but again, because they have the backup X. So this is intriguing because when you look at things like death data, what we see is that more boy babies die during the first year of life than girl babies. Women have a longer life expectancy than do men. Women are less likely to suffer many, some health problems later in life. And one might speculate that this may have to do with that she has this backup X chromosome. Perhaps the X chromosome carries some longevity, some genes that predict if you're going to live to be 105. Well, if you've inherited an X from if you're a man and you inherit an X from your mother that says you're going to have a short life and you don't have the backup that says you're going to have a long life, perhaps that explains some of these other health differences that we see with boys and girls or men and women. I've speculated that one of the reasons that there are more boys die in the first year of life, and actually more boys die at every stage of life compared to women, is that it's easier. She makes fewer genetic mistakes when she is replacing herself, when she's creating a version of an XX like herself. There's fewer mistakes. But when she is creating or growing a genetically different offspring, then I don't know. I'm just speculating. Okay, so this is a slide about some other genetics. So it's important that you understand what we mean by congenital or genetic defects. I just can't stand that word. I wish I could think of a better word. But the abnormalities, I don't like that word either. It just all implies that there's something less than. But there are some differences that are inherited on the genes, that are inherited when the sperm and the egg meet, that can grow to become something that makes it difficult for in some health cases. And these are some examples, and I think that's an example of an exam. I believe that's an exam question to offer to know, label one or two genetic conditions. And what it means to be genetic, think about in your genes, or congenital. I don't know what congenital means. I mean, I don't know where it comes from, but genes, congenital means that they're products of your genes. You're not exposed to something, and that's why it happened. One of them is sickle cell, and I believe we talked about sickle cell when we were talking about environmental. Shoot, that may have been my other class. But sickle cell is a genetic condition in which instead of your blood cells being formed like this perfect circle, some of them are formed in the shape of a sickle. And it is far more common in people, in dark complected people and black and brown people. But it's also more common in people who come from, are descendants of people from the equator region. Evolutionary psychologists have argued, and so what happens, this is a challenge because it makes makes it difficult for your cells to carry oxygen. I understand it can be quite painful. And I think I read that it's also harder to recover from illnesses if you have sickle cell, because effectively the red blood cells that carry the oxygen can't effectively or as efficiently carry oxygen. But the evolutionary psychologists argue that it is a phenomena from people, and the reason we see it more in black and brown people than we do in white people is because ancestrally, these are folks that would have lived in the equator, around warmer regions. And malaria, folks that, if you have sickle cell anemia, you are more likely to survive malaria. So from the perspective of an evolutionary psychology, sickle cell anemia would promote your survival in a part of the world where you are more likely to suffer from malaria. So you have sickle cell, you get malaria, you survive. Your neighbor doesn't have sickle cell, they get malaria and they die. You pass on your sickle cell genes to your next generation, who then also have sickle cell, but they're more likely to survive malaria. So it's an example of natural selection where certain traits that promoted your survival get passed on into the next generation. But that's not what I want you to remember. What I want you to remember is it's genetic. Another one is cystic fibrosis, which, to be perfectly honest, I did not know what cystic fibrosis was until I started teaching this class. It is a tendency, it makes it difficult to breathe. It is a tendency for mucus to collect in your breathing, in your trachea and in your lungs. So it can impair your quality of life, your ability to breathe if you have cystic fibrosis. Another one, I just saw a news story about a little boy who was born with a cleft lip, or a cleft lip and a cleft palate. And that's basically, it's like when the skull is forming, and the face is forming, it doesn't completely come together, that instead there's an opening. So that's what this is. In this case, this child, I guess, just has a cleft palate, and there's literally an opening in the top of your head. the top of your palate, the top of your mouth, roof of your mouth. In the cleft lip and the cleft palate, it's an opening in the top of your palate, but also into your lip, and so they sew it back up. They sew it back together. But I recently read a story about a little boy who had cleft lip, and he adopted a dog who was also born with cleft lip, but it's a genetic condition. Okay, I'm going to stop right here, and when we come back, we will talk about the earliest stages of prenatal development.